Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, our speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics and related conversations. We're currently exploring the past, present and future of cybernetics and related disciplines. In the next 30 minutes, our speakers will cover answers to different questions regarding their thoughts on cybernetics, its past, present and future. They're the same 4 questions we'll be asking all of our speakers. Following the session, you'll be able to find a recording plus a snack pack of resources related to take home and devour on our website. To keep this session focused and on time, there won't be time for audience questions, and you'll see we will disable the chat to limit distractions. Straight after the talk, our speaker will join our PhD students for their Q&A session. For everyone else, we encourage you to create your own opportunities to continue the conversation. Before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are speaking with you today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. So I'll introduce our speakers today, Dr Paul Atkinson from Monash and Dr Richie Barker from Deakin. I've invited them here today because their recent paper, AI and the Social Construction of Creativity, was included in one of our recent PhD topic seminars. The topic of AI and creativity I personally find very fascinating and very cybernetic in its terms of understanding the system of creativity and the usefulness of humans in the loop. So let's get started. Thank you, Paul and Richie.
Thanks, Jess. I'm going to start for Paul and myself. And first up, thanks for inviting us along and being part of your conversation about the past, present and future of cybernetics. It's really nice to make this connection and to reflect on our research to date with this framework. I wanted to start with a bit of background about myself. I am a critical advertising studies academic at Deakin. And before I became an academic, I worked in advertising for about 15 or so years as a creative copywriter, and then a digital content writer, and also a creative strategist. And when I was in industry, I loved the job, but I became quite obsessed with the question of where ideas come from. And that kind of led me into my research career, my second career. But I stuck with advertising as a phenomenon, an object of my study, and mainly because a core institutional goal of advertising is to attract attention and to build relationships. And very often this is achieved through creativity or a surprise effect through content. It's often noted that creativity is the lifeblood of the advertising industry, and as a result, I think it's such an interesting case study as this industry sits at the intersection of art and commerce. A lot of volume of creative work is produced in advertising, but of course, it's always also worth noting that a lot of very uncreative work is produced and as part of advertising outputs. But my interests as an academic aren't so much the transactional or hard sell forms of advertising that are naturally quite programmatic and repetitive in their construction. What I'm interested in is more higher concept, more creative advertising that both reflects and shapes culture. So I suppose the core of my interest is the relationship between advertising, creativity and culture. And a core focus of my research and as I see it, how it connects to cybernetics is that this form of creativity isn't solely situated in the individual. It's a result of systems that both enable and constrain possibilities, and I'll be talking a bit about that today. And as someone that also worked in digital media in my transition from being a practitioner to an academic, I wasn't just interested in where ideas came from, but also how emerging technologies are reshaping the creative process. And that's led me into working with Paul for over 10 years. Paul was my PhD supervisor, and you'll notice today are two different, but we very much hope complementary yin and yang approaches, in that I take generally a more applied approach to my thinking, and Paul brings this beautiful, wonderful philosophy of science perspective to it, which fuels our collaboration. So I suppose bouncing off the paper that you've read, and that's very flattering that you have done so, about emerging forms of artificial intelligence in the creative process. Just to reinforce that I'm not a technologist. I'm not an engineer. I'm very passionate about and curious about the social life of technology in creative practice, in design, in advertising, and increasingly in filmmaking with projects that I'm currently working on now. But I think before we kind of jump into some provocations that extend our paper, it's useful just to get a hold on the concept of creativity and how it's commonly explored in the scholarship. The dominant scholarly definition conceptualizes creativity as the production of an object or an artifact that is both novel or original, but importantly also appropriate to a given task. It's valuable in a particular context. Now, both criteria are required, and those criteria become part of a judging process involving a relevant social or expert community. That's the understanding we're working with. But it's worth noting that understanding is somewhat product focused, and of course there is a lot of a body of research that veers towards creative process. So not so much analysing the object, but analysing the process. And Keith Sawyer, who is a really wonderful academic in this space of creativity and creative process across lots of different domains. In his research, he's identified 3 waves of creativity research, which I think is interesting to kind of revisit as part of this overview of what is creativity. The first wave was mid last century, and that was the body of research that started to get interested in creativity and looked at it in terms of the individual, and in often quite a romanticized way, but looked at it in terms of personality traits. And that continued for a couple of decades until the next wave, which is a period where cognition was the focus. And psychologists went hard in terms of looking at how associative thinking was achieved and cognitive functions. But then the third wave came towards the end of last century in the 1980s and 1990s with a more socio-cultural approach, which has become quite dominant in studying creativity today. And one of the most well-known proponents is Mike Csikszentmihalyi. Margaret Bowden also was part of this third wave that started to look at creativity beyond the individual process, but as a system that emerges between relationships, between different groupings, relationships, interactions. It's a core part of our paper, looking at these three systems. Just to refresh your memory, the domain is a cultural repository of symbolic rules, knowledge, previous creative artifacts that have been judged to be novel. The next system is the field system, who are gatekeepers who have a largely evaluative function, and they evaluate novelty and appropriateness of any novel variations that come before them. But they also are in a position where they can either support or constrain creativity in a contextual sense or an organisational sense. And the other system is the individual. So the human in this thinking that draws information from the domain and then produces a novel variation that is evaluated by the field, and then it goes back into the domain to inspire future novel variation. So that kind of systems thinking, as I mentioned, has been really powerful, and it's been guiding my work for the past 10 years since I've been an academic and working with Paul. So when we saw an article by Csikszentmihalyi, co-authored by Grona in 2018 on AI and the creative process, Paul and I got very interested in their findings. Of interest to us, and I suppose maybe even somewhat perplexing to us, was that the article appeared to focus on the question of whether AI replaces the creative individual. And of course, that's quite a dominant discourse in culture at the moment. But both of us felt that this is perhaps the wrong question. Even though AI does replicate some human creative tasks and can produce novel variations, what Paul and I are more focused on and interrogating today with you is how it reshapes relationships within the creative process. So we're interested in a more holistic approach to understanding the impact of these emerging technologies, and not just focusing on generative AI, which gets a lot of attention, but also looking at how machine learning and AI is embedded in other technologies, particularly recommendation algorithms, and that are in search engines and so forth, which I think is going to be of interest to you, given how cybernetics works. In our article on AI and the social construction of creativity, we sought to develop a variation of the systems model, which looked at the kind of broader scope of these technologies to identify some provocations. And the rest of this talk from me is going to be drawing out some what I feel are very interesting facets in the conversation about creative process as a system. Things that I feel really warrant further exploration and perhaps aren't getting that attention in the current moment. The first area that I wanted to talk about is the concept of friction. I'm particularly fascinated by this topic and perhaps the lack of discussion in what I'm seeing when authors talk about AI and the creative process. In a lot of discussions about AI and the creative industries that Paul and I are coming across, friction is treated as a problem to be overcome. And perhaps this mimics the technologist's worldview, where friction is often framed as something to be removed or optimized out of existence. A current paper we're working on is looking at these dominant big tech discourses and the valorization of speed and efficiency in the creative process. But for us, optimization, we feel, really misses something super important about how creativity actually works. So friction in terms of mistakes that both the user and the model have or experience, or barriers to knowledge, or barriers to achieving or executing an idea or producing an artifact. A slow engagement with an unfamiliar object, which is inefficient, but so often it's that rabbit hole that you go down that may not have an immediate outcome, but becomes so important in 2 weeks, 3 months later as part of your practice. This time isn't wasted. This friction isn't wasted. It's where a lot of the most interesting and powerful work occurs. And Paul will talk about this in a moment, but it's the space where those unexpected associations form, serendipitously encountering material you weren't looking for, and often where the obvious answer, the perfect answer, gets rejected for a better one. I'm currently doing a project on AI filmmaking and interviewing AI filmmakers, and I was talking last Friday with an AI filmmaker about his practice and his work with image to video models. And he said something that really struck me on this topic of friction. In our interview, he very commonly discussed the limitations of generative AI models in terms of the things they couldn't do and the moments where the outputs weren't what he wanted. But what was really interesting to me about that is that he didn't discuss these experiences with frustration or kind of even as a problem. He actually discussed them as helping support his novelty. So, for example, he was talking about a scene where he was trying to have a human in the foreground and then a shadow in the background, and the shadow was moving independently to the human, and that was part of the narrative. And the model just couldn't do it. And so he was spending a lot of time on one model trying to do this particular thing, and then he'd go to another model and do this, try and do this, and it wouldn't work. And then he went through every video model he had, and could not achieve this one scene. But what I found so interesting is that he wasn't complaining about it. He was telling me that this friction, this feedback loop, actually was guiding him into new possibilities. And I suppose why this matters to me and why I'm raising it today is because these kind of frictions, these prompt issues, these like glitches, when they happen, they can open new possibilities. But what happens when the model finally is perfected, when the model is frictionless, which in the technologist worldview is how they would want these models to work? You know, what is lost? And look, I find that the systems model from Csikszentmihalyi, and you know, is particularly useful in terms of understanding these relationships. And importantly, that friction isn't the property of the individual creative, that it lives in the relationship between the individual and how they draw from the domain and how they draw from the field, and that kind of resistance from drawing from the domain and the pushback that you might get from the field as part of the evaluative process, and the production constraints that help you achieve a novel variation. And again, when AI smooths out these relationships, it's yes, it's speeding things up, but it's changing the system in quite dramatic ways in terms of what it can produce. And I suppose at this point, it's worth reinforcing that Paul and I, and our argument is not about anti-AI. It's in this instance, it's just kind of teasing out these dimensions and thinking about the importance of friction before it is engineered away, and kind of reinforcing the importance of with this kind of work of kind of this close engagement with practitioners and kind of understanding in a finely grained way how they approach it and what actually matters to them. The other provocation, or the other idea that I'm really interested in at the moment, both in terms of the work Paul and I are doing and also studying AI filmmakers, is cultural intelligence, and within that, the concept or the notion of taste. If we take the view that AI is reshaping the creative process rather than replacing the creative individual, then that really allows us to focus on what the human is doing in this reshaped sociocultural system. And for me, a big part of what they are doing, and a really important part, is exercising taste. And so, for example, when an advertising copywriter generates a bunch of headlines, 20 headlines, and is hoping to achieve a novel effect from that, or if a designer kind of works with Midjourney to achieve a whole series of different outputs from that model, what we're seeing here, which is quite interesting, is that creative labour is very much shifting from generation into selection, and the creative is not just making. They're kind of making these interesting decisions largely based on taste and cultural knowledge on what is worth keeping, what is able to be modified, and of course what to reject. So in that instance, the creative individual is now operating in the field as the field within this creative process, which is a shift. And broader taste systems are really central to that process. And with the concept of taste, I'm not so much conceiving that as a personal flourish. So in terms of broader taste systems, it's not about a personal flourish. And often when you hear discourses about generative AI, often it's described as a creative uses it and then adds some human nuance over the top. But but really what we're looking at is much deeper than that surface level. It's about cultural intelligence that is fundamentally systemic, and really thinking through how taste is shaped by what you're exposed to, and the people that you interact with in these creative system, and what your field values, and how you discover those values and those conventions, and importantly, the cultural moment that you're living in and experiencing. So it's an individual sensibility that's calibrated through this shared system. And I know Paul's going to talk about specificity in a moment, and I've probably gone over my time, but I'm interested in kind of looking at all these things in terms of a cybernetic framing, and taste not being a static object or a purely internal object, but how it's part of a feedback system, and this ongoing collaboration with culture that's constantly shifting and constantly being inflected through life experience. I mean, of course, a model can give you a Gen AI model can give you novelty, and it can give you access to current cultural data, but that is not the same as experiencing that cultural artifact. Selection requires you to be plugged into a living system and not just being informed by it. And look, the same applies to filtering, which we're also really interested in, and personalization algorithms, and what you search for, and what references you bring in, and how technologies shape that as well. But I just wanted to finish with an anecdote, and that relates again to advertising, which is my area. And I was speaking to a very well-known, very successful advertising creative the other day. He's very well regarded for the high concept novel work that he produces for global brands, and I was asking him about this topic of AI and creativity and advertising, because it's a big topic. It's getting a lot of attention, and I said, what should my students know in this moment? And he looked at me and said, they should go see a film. That was his answer. They should go see a film. So interestingly, it wasn't perhaps what you'd expect. That like they need to work on their prompt engineering to get the most out of it, or they need to get on top of this, or fear being left behind, which those discourses are circulating very widely. But I suppose that what he was telling me, and what I'm so interested in, is taste systems, and being in culture, and from a systems perspective about keeping the feedback loop open, and experiencing that input, in addition to a world which is filtered and algorithmically curated. So how much of creative practitioners relate to these emerging technologies, for me, comes to taste, and I think the AI moment has shone a light on that, and their cultural knowledge, and their relationship to culture, and how that becomes just so important in these relationships. And yeah, particularly, and again, Paul's going to speak on this in more detail, but particularly in the current media environment, where so much of that will involve such high volume, often quite standardized, low effort content, and for brands and communicators wanting to rise above that, that I feel that friction in the process, and taste in the selection, are going to really help them rise to the top with their craft and their practice. Over to Paul.
All right, I'll go through kind of fairly quickly. Now, I won't introduce myself much at all, besides to say, I'm pretty much every medium, from dance all the way through to technology, through kind of comic books, classical music, whatever. So I write all the different media, but I also treat them in terms of things like affordances and those things. So I'm kind of really thinking a little about the idea between relationship between human and machine kind of creativity, and not to say I'm going to say they're kind of different, but the idea whether the differences themselves are productive, and that's the main thing. Now, the typical way of looking at the idea of creativity in a lot of areas is, especially from the kind of romantic era, it's this idea of a kind of intentional genius that kind of comes out from nowhere. And it's kind of quasi-mystical idea of kind of creativity, etc. Now, this is kind of an old notion. This is a very famous kind of painting of a young poet who died. And the idea is that kind of blood on paper, all those kind of things. Where does it come from? We don't know. But the other kind of thing here is there's the other side of the things is looking at the idea of an external set of kind of procedures. So you've got one extreme is the almost like coming from nowhere, and you've got the other side is the external procedure, those kind of opposition. And of course, most of these issues are somewhere in between. And what I'm kind of interested really is in fostering human potential within the context of an AI environment. So let's have a look, think about this kind of issue. So what does it really mean for humans to be creative alongside AI? And what's the kind of areas you can look at this kind of thing? Richie mentioned a few about what does it mean to produce content when there's actually a surfeit of content, too much content around? How does it mean to produce when you're always kind of being working external systems of recommendation? All that kind of stuff goes along. The other side I want to kind of talk about today, and this is what we're kind of writing on at the moment, is focusing on the idea a little bit on human distinctiveness as a productive mechanism in the kind of process. Now, I'll give you a quote. Now, a lot of the human distinctiveness stuff talks about the idea of the importance of intention and also things like awareness, apperception, intentionality, consciousness, all those things. And this is quite different to the ones that are really focused on outputs. You focus on outputs, it's almost like you've got a discrete object and you work back from that object to the procedures that made it. This one says you have to still have things like awareness that are continuous with the creative gesture. And this is a quote from Erden, and Erden was kind of talking about from this kind of particular kind of angle. And what she's kind of talking about is this kind of idea that AI actually occupies a different kind of space. It's not a human space. It might produce things that resemble human outputs. It's all about relevance and all the rest of it. But the idea is that things come from a different place. So what I'm going to do is trying to get two different kind of converging narratives to come together in the kind of form of this talk. So they talk about different language games and what it means that to be intentionally different. And I think we are different from machines fundamentally. I mean, a lot of people have been writing about the idea of the human consciousness has been broken down to algorithmic forms, RAM memory, all the rest of it. But if we put that to one side, there are structural differences. So that's what I'll go through now. So I'll go through it fairly quickly. So the first kind of question is, can automated systems demonstrate creativity? In terms of that ontological issue, no, they can't. If you mean creativity is a particular type of aware intentional action. However, in terms of the idea of the products, what is actually produced, we could probably say they are creative. So we're judging on that level. And the things like the systems model judges it on the product and its place within history, not in the way it got to that product. So that's kind of a big part of it. And you've seen famous ones. These are well before generative AI. Howard Cohen and Aaron is the kind of computer programs, kind of drawings. Famous ones, of course, with the David Cope stuff, where he was actually getting algorithmically rather than through machine learning, getting to actually kind of replicate the kind of productive structure of kind of Bach, music production, Mozart, etc. All those kind of things going on. Now, a lot of these kind of older systems work really well because they had discrete objects, discrete units of data, and then they had procedures to describe the movement of that data. So they work quite well. And this is really what you would call an externalization of creativity. And I just thought I'd bring something in at this point, which is quite interesting, is that it's funny that I actually remember using in a paper a little while back, I used the term generative to refer to human production. And the reviewer says, that's not right. Generative AI is about what's happening now. And actually they're wrong, of course. I wouldn't say it otherwise. But they're kind of wrong in the sense that the word generative was actually used in literary production for many years beforehand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the externalization of creativity, and then what it means to go back into the internalization. And these kind of things are really strong. So these things focus a lot on what they call combinatorial creativity, units, procedures, modification, translation, all that stuff. Now, the combinatorial creativity, make an unfamiliar combination of familiar ideas. Anyone can do it. I can get a student in the room to say, here's 10 words, mix them up and create something new. They'll be able to do it, no problem. But this is this idea of this externalization of creativity. And this was in this early forms. Like, I'll give you an example from Oulipo. Oulipo is a kind of called the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle. And it was a kind of a French, kind of largely French movement that looked at using kind of generative principles to create new texts. And this was going on in the human environment as well for a long period of time. So here's an example. Combine two proverbs, and they had a procedure. and they go, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, plus to kill two birds with one stone. And they'll smush them together. And this is a structural thing. To kill two birds in the bush with one stone is better than one in the hand. Or an apple a day keeps a doctor away, plus a forbidden fruit might be the forbidden fruit keeps the doctor away. So there's all these enormous potential for producing something new through these kind of structural external procedures. I'll leave this one out because we're going to keep up for time, but I just made my own up and gave a procedure for producing new text. Now, we can certainly do this, but I think in this kind of current environment, this kind of productive kind of process is quite often better suited to the combinatorial kind of ability of lots of different kind of forms of automated technology. I won't use AI specifically, because it could be other forms of systems. So let's just shift on to the thing. So I'll go back to the kind of key point. This is what Richie raised about the idea of lived experience. Now, I think this is important, but not necessarily for what you want it to be. I think lived experience is actually incredibly productive, as opposed to just being, as Richie said, the gloss on what we do, like a little effectual dimension that you add on top, those kind of things. No, it actually is very productive because it relates to the very way we produce, but also the very way we receive information. So I'll give you an example here. This is two kind of key points, time and particularity. Now, time, why is time important? Now, you can prove me wrong. I'm happy for anyone in your organization to say this is not true. But I don't think that any kind of technology experiences time in the way we do, because time for technology can be sped up. If our time's sped up, things change their form, colors change their form, the way that words work together change, everything kind of fundamentally changes because time's integral to the very nature of experience. So here's an example here. This is an example of a metaphor. This is a Rubik's Cube used to describe how they're kind of fixing up and working together to create a better city, etc., from this bus network. And of course, we've got this kind of format here, which is a Rubik's Cube, and you've got this idea of transport the city, and you've got people active in that process. Now, what's important in this idea is not the idea that it creates the idea, the thing that's finished. It's actually there's two things working together. In one state, the Rubik's Cube, the metaphorical form, and then you've got the idea of the city in the other one. And when you're actually thinking through these ideas, you're constantly oscillating between the two. So when you've got this human notion, there's a certain idea of kind of oscillation, but also ambiguity, and the fact that things aren't fully reconciled. They never kind of compact totally together. So that's just one example. Do another one. Here's an interesting one, really great advertisement. Not this one so much, but it says, today's World Alzheimer's Day, do not forget. This is pretty straightforward. It just says, what is on? Here's a picture of a brain that's shrunk, all those things. This could be a problem, we should be aware, not an issue. But I want to show you the second one. This is really important about the idea why time itself is central to the idea of creative production and reception. This is a fantastic advertisement. It's actually simpler than the other one, no image involved. You've got today is World Alzheimer's Day. Today is World Alzheimer's Day. And I keep going today. And the fact of actually saying it itself is one, of course, temporal. Of course, it's iterative and all those kind of things. But what's really going on here is that it emulates the very act of trying to remember. And this is something we've got to look at when we talk about creativity. Forget about the completed text. Think about the temporal elements that are inside that text and actually form it as a kind of like a structure. And this is a really key one there. So I'm trying to think more, this is what they call here a poetic function. And it's not to do with the referent, but to the actual form of the actual thing itself. And the form can only really be lived by a human. And therefore that form element is also really strong in the production of these things. I'll just give a few more minutes. So I'll just go another on the same kind of point, but there's also this kind of relationship between the general and the particular. And this is a really, really important one. Of course, these big kind of LLMs and other kind of forms are producing kind of forms using a large amount of data. And they're kind of, I use a technical term, they're smushing that data to create an utterance of some form or another. And the utterance has to be salient. You've got to get through a GAN, all the rest of it, all those things, so we understand it. Fine. But what is it about the human where it kind of relates to that? And I think what we've got to do really is actually start to develop ideas in which we're moving between the general and the particular. And the human's really good with the particular. What do I mean by that? If I've got to, I'm looking at something now, I'm looking at a computer screen, I've got the most beautiful Venetian blinds you could ever imagine. I've got a kind of a beige wall, which is typical Monash, and a whole identity is built around it. All those things are in front of me. I can see texture. I can see form, I can see the little ripples in things, all the rest of it. And I see them as I look at the room, the idea or the referent itself comes after the fact. All those things are visible. Now we can use this kind of what they call the sensuality of human experience as a creative kind of impetus. The narrow view of what we see as opposed to the global view of what an AI system will see. That narrow view is really, really important for creating kind of new things. So we've got to be sensitive to these things. So if I was talking to students about how to produce text, I would be saying do things like touch an object. If you're going to make a beer commercial, drink the beer, that kind of stuff. But even the idea of taste itself then can become a trigger for a creative kind of act. So I'm not saying you don't use the AI, but you've got to also combine these two elements together. And I won't say much more, but I can give you thousands of examples. But what I'll just do end on, there's also this idea about how we produce. And this is where Richie and I are particularly interested at the moment. There's all these models, this is only a partial model, but there's all these kind of forms like preparation, incubation, insight, the way that we come towards an idea. And a lot of the kind of all these tech companies are talking about speeding up all these processes from incubation, preparation, ideation, all that stuff, just making it faster and faster. But in some sense, and there's all this material on this from scientific creativity all the way to kind of artistic creativity, talking about the importance of things like incubation. So I think we've got to work out, if you're going to develop systems, you've got to develop systems which allow the time of human production to be carved out a space within those systems that allow them to work at their optimal as well. So you've got to get the human working optimally and the automated system working optimally, but they work on different timescales. So you can't optimize everything in the same way. You can't externalize everything. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I was trying to give the 10 minutes. I'm not sure what time it is, but I hope it all makes sense.
That was perfect, both of you. Thank you so much. I really loved both of your presentations. That was absolutely wonderful. Particular highlights for me were around the importance of friction and taste and what it means to create alongside machines and the importance of time in that. So I'm going to stop recording now and I'll hand over to the PhD students.